We're going to move to Principle 10. I think this is one that you all will know about, and you'll probably say, of course we do that all the time. And when you hear Nora's perspective on this one, you're going to go, oh, wow, whoops. Principle 10, transparency, communication, and engagement. Governance structures and practices should be transparent and designed to encourage communication and engagement with shareholders and other key stakeholders on matters of importance. What we want to address in this principle is by focusing on the corporate approach to sustainability, and here we want to discuss best practices and impacts around balancing your communication and your engagement. Nora, you've got a really great perspective on this one, and I'd love for you to
I'm not sure how
share.
great it is, but my board journey, I try to do one non-US board in my portfolio, and so I've been on boards of several companies in several countries. And this Nordic board that I'm on in Sweden, it's interesting that they don't have an ESG story. They have a company story. There's just one story, the company story. And then feathered throughout as a natural part of telling a story are all the things that are most material to them for sustainability of the company in the long term. And I really thought when I'm in the US boardroom or I watch an investor pitch, there's numbers and this is what we do, and then it's almost like, and now it's brought to you by ESG, and they pull out a different slide, and it's like, we had a carnival for muscular dystrophy, and we fed some whales, and there's some women, and there's some families here, and feed the veterans, and now let's go back to the story. So it seemed, and I made it illustrative and kind of silly, but it seemed like we have this ESG story, and it sits here. And then this is the company's story and what it does there. I think what I've learned is that there's one story, and there's some really big critical success factors. So I do many in technology. So at AMD, for example, we don't have a fab, we don't have a factory. We have really incredibly trained engineers, so talent is our big, must have access to incredibly great talent, must get more people to major in material science and in electrical engineering. These are the things that are hugely core to us. That's a big part of our ESG message, which is how do we attract, retain, how do we become a congregation for those scary smart people that we'll need in the future. And we don't talk about water. And we don't talk about, not that there's anything wrong with it, but we don't talk about things that aren't most material to us, and then really put them in a way that explains how this is critical to our long-term story. So I think that there's a lot of talk also in the US of aligning our stories. So there's a corporate recruiting page, and then there's an investor deck, and then there's partners. But when you have one story, you don't need to align it. It's you might have to modify a little piece of it, but you don't need any big sort of alignment to put it together. So I think that on the transparency, regulations just go up in the future. You're seeing it now on climate. Now we're getting letters from the SEC on tell us how your lead director is qualified to perform oversight of risk. So I think those of you that were certified, I think you're going to start to see directors' bios highlighting their cyber cert or their NACD certified, et cetera. But I do think the transparency of what we do it and how we do it is, from a risk side, some of the lawyers in the room will say, well, no good deed goes unpunished. It opens you up to an activist the more they know. And on the other side, if you just have a through line through your strategy, your purpose, et cetera, I think that really shores you up. And you stay consistent. So it's going to be really interesting, but I think there'll be more transparency, more disclosure, and take a look at how you're communicating your ESG.
Good point.
What do you think, James?
James?
I would just add that for us to have transparency to the external stakeholders, investors, public, customers, we need transparency internally. Yeah. And I think that's what risk management's about, right? Because if you don't have internal transparency, if you don't know what drives earnings volatility, for example, it's hard to express that to the outside world. And the outside world is, don't want surprises. Mm-hmm. They don't want unexpected things. And I think one of the key policies as a board member, I would always look for, one is a risk appetite statement that says for given risk, what is the levels that I'm comfortable with across all my risk factor. And the two is a very simple thing to do. It's a risk escalation policy. Under what criteria would the board get communicated to between meetings? Right? Is it a $10 million unexpected loss? Is it some event? We want that level of transparency from management. And if we do that, management is going to push that level of transparency through the organization because they don't want to be surprised. And I think for us to have that external transparency that Nora and Sam are talking about, we need that internal transparency.
Yep. And you also mentioned at one point a feedback loop, the how maybe of this transparency, right?
Yeah, that's my third takeaway. Then I'll shut up. So to me, the most important thing in any process, whether it's ESG or enterprise risk management, is one, define what is the objective. Right? What are we trying to accomplish, and how do we measure that? And then we do a bunch of things. And what's the result? Right? And if we're not getting the results that we want, then we need to change the things that we're doing. This is also known as the scientific method. Okay? So how do we apply the scientific method to our business processes? So when it comes to ESG, how do we measure performance? How do we shape it? And then in terms of enterprise risk management, in my mind, the objective of enterprise risk management is not to minimize losses or negative events, but it's to minimize unexpected performance variance. So the objective of enterprise risk management is to minimize unexpected performance variance. So for a for-profit company, you could say is to minimize unexpected earnings variance. So sometimes you take risk, you're going to have more earnings variance. What you don't want is the unexpected sources of earnings variance. So what we did at eRisk was we would do earnings at risk in the beginning of the period. Right? What are the underlying drivers? Interest rates, credit performance, trading volume. And at the end of the period, we would do earnings attribution analysis. And then we'd compare the two and say how much of the actual earnings variance we had known about, we had measured and quantified, how much was it unexpected? And the whole objective of risk management is to minimize that number. And that creates a feedback loop. And to me, in any business process, we should apply that scientific method.
Perfect. Nora, any other closing comments on this transparency, communication, and engagement? You built us up on the say-do concept of...
Well, that was the thing is, I think you made a point of transparency inside the organizations. Now you have these separate silos. One's giving money to some candidate, one is doing this, and then some employee figures out it's not aligned. And then they go to Twitter, and then that comes out. So I think that in part of your oversight is, now that we've agreed on these, how is it audited, and what's the operating system to make sure that those things stay in alignment? Because you would hate to have a reputational damage of your say-do ratio.
Right.
If you're saying you're doing these things, what's the ratio between what you said and what you did? Because there's, like I said, the activists inside your company are really gonna hold you accountable to that.
Yep. Fantastic.